All right, let's dive into a really fascinating parable of change. It's a story about a world made of absolute stone and how it gets completely shattered by two, and I mean completely different, forces. The quiet stain of some cheap ink and the sharp edge of a chaotic blade. So picture this, a kingdom that feels like it's been ripped right from the pages of an old pulp novel. We're talking about a world of eternal twilight, a place defined by rigid, unbending order. This isn't just a kingdom with a lot of laws. It's a realm where existence itself is supposed to be predictable, unchanging, and totally absolute.
So, who's in charge here? Well, you've got these high sorcerers and the so-called arbiters of stasis. They believe in this philosophy of static control. They're working off what the source material calls stained blueprints, totally convinced that every single part of reality can and should be locked down by inflexible law.
And this right here is the absolute key, this core belief in static control. It's this grand illusion that the world can be perfectly ordered, perfectly predictable. And this unwavering kind of brittle certainty is the very thing that our two agents of change are about to smash to pieces, coming from two totally different directions.
Now, the assault on this stone-cold stasis didn't come from some big, unified rebellion. Oh no, it came from two vastly different fronts, one bubbling up from the dusty, cramped basements of the common folk, and the other screaming down from a tall, jagged spire that pierces the sky.
And you really couldn't imagine two more different groups. On one side, you have the humble pulp scribes. These are just mortals working with flimsy paper and harsh ink. And on the other, the chaotic spirits, ancient, primal forces, literal architects of chaos who don't even belong in the world of men.
Okay, so let's start with the scribes. These aren't celebrated authors, not by a long shot. They're basically working-class storytellers stuck in a dusty basement, just writing to survive. Their materials are cheap, but their book covers, they just explode with these vibrant, impossible colors, grabbing the attention of people who are just starved for something more than gray stone. They're writing tales of detectives, explorers, starships, planting these little seeds of wonder.
Then, in stark contrast, you've got the spirits. For centuries, these three siblings, the wit, the hunger, and the small, have been locked away in that spire, their gilded cage, for one simple reason. They are chaos. Their very existence is a middle finger to the kingdom's rigid order.
So both groups wanted to tear down this empire of stasis. But wow, their weapons and their strategies were polar opposites. One fought a slow, quiet war of culture. The other waged a direct, explosive assault on reality itself.
The scribes, they were playing the long game. They didn't lead armies, they just wrote stories. Their cheap paper and harsh ink created these incredible worlds of cosmic dread and heroic adventure. They weren't directly trying to start a revolution, but by selling dreams, they slowly, almost secretly, changed what the people dreamed about.
Now the spirits? Subtlety was not in their vocabulary. When their seals finally broke, they just spilled into the world like living ink. And their laughter? It wasn't just a sound. The text calls it a jagged blade that just sliced through logic. Their whole goal was to dismantle the kingdom's absurd structures by showing everyone just how fragile they really were.
And this really lays out the two game plans, doesn't it? The scribes had this long-term strategy. Their dreams plant seeds of wonder, and over generations, the entire culture transforms. The spirit's path? It's immediate. It's explosive. They burst out of their prison to shatter expectations, causing the kingdom's rigid reality to just collapse in on itself.
So what happens when these two forces finally come to a head? You know, when the slow-burning fuse of the scribe's stories meets the explosive chaos of the spirits. Well, this is the moment the kingdom's illusions finally start to crack wide open.
And this gets to a really critical question. This whole kingdom is built on a sense of absolute, ironclad authority, an unearned majesty. But what is that majesty really made of? What happens when you actually poke it?
And here's the answer. Turns out, beneath the stone facade, beneath the iron crowns and the rigid laws, there's nothing but a deep, hollow fear. And that is the core truth, the central weakness that both the patient scribes and the chaotic spirits managed to drag out into the light.
You can see the two impacts so clearly here. The spirits acted directly, right now. They waltzed into the king's court and turned his power into a joke, a humiliating spectacle. Their actions transformed that grim fortress into a surreal playhouse almost overnight.
The scribes' impact was way slower. Their stories inspired the people, and over time the kingdom actually began to build the very machines and copy the very heroes from those cheap paperbacks.
You know, the Spirits' legacy was never about grabbing power for themselves. They never wanted the throne. What they really hungered for was the sound of shattering expectations. They showed everyone that the king's power was just a mask, hiding that hollow fear. And once their work was done, poof, they vanished.
The scribes' legacy is a different story, but just as powerful. Their flimsy paper crumbled to dust, their names were totally forgotten. But their ideas, those seeds of wonder they planted, they grew to become the very foundation of a new culture. It just goes to show that timeless change can come from the absolute humblest of beginnings.
So, after the Spirits' mocking laughter fades and the last of the scribes' ink is dry, what's left? What became of the Stone Kingdom? Let's take a look at the legacy left behind by this incredible collision of chaos and creation.
In the end, you can't really say either group won in the traditional sense. The Spirits disappeared. The scribes were forgotten. But both were, without a doubt, successful. They took this fragile illusion of static control and they smashed it, paving the way for real, lasting change. You could say the Spirits were the ones who deconstructed the old world, while the scribes provided the creative blueprints for the new one. You needed both.
And that leaves us with this fascinating final question to chew on. What's the more powerful force for transformation? Is it the creative act, that patient story that slowly builds a vision for the future? Or is it the chaotic act, the mocking laugh that exposes the absurdity of the present and shatters it into a million pieces? Definitely something to think about.